You've probably noticed something strange happening as you've gotten older and started thinking more deeply about life. The more you question, the fewer friends you have. The more you analyze, the more alone you feel. The deeper you think, the further you drift from the people around you. You might blame yourself for this isolation. Maybe you think you're too negative, too critical, or too intense. But Friedrich Nietzsche understood something most people never realize. Your growing loneliness isn't a personal failing. It's the inevitable result of independent thinking in a world that punishes authenticity. Nietzsche wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. To be your own man is a hard business. If you try it, you'll be lonely often, and sometimes frightened. The more you think for yourself, the less you fit into the collective delusions that hold most social groups together. And most people, consciously or unconsciously, will punish you for refusing to participate in those delusions." Let's explore why thinking makes you unpopular and what Nietzsche discovered about the brutal choice between intellectual honesty and social acceptance. Nietzsche spent his life observing human behavior, and one of his most unsettling discoveries was that most people don't actually want to think. They want to belong. They don't want truth. They want comfort. They don't want insight. They want validation. They don't want to question their beliefs. They want those beliefs confirmed and reinforced by others. He wrote, "The most common lie is that which one lies to himself. Lying to others is relatively an exception." Most people live in carefully constructed bubbles of self-deception, and they need others to participate in maintaining those bubbles. When you start thinking independently, you become a threat to the collective fiction that everyone has agreed to believe. This is why the more you think, the less they like you. You're not just thinking differently. You're threatening the foundation of their psychological security. Let's examine how this dynamic plays out in different areas of life. Career and success myths. When you start questioning whether climbing the corporate ladder actually leads to fulfillment, or whether accumulating wealth truly creates happiness, you become uncomfortable to be around for people who've organized their entire lives around these pursuits. Your questions force them to confront the possibility that they're chasing illusions, relationship and love fantasies. When you start recognizing that many relationships are based on mutual ego-stroking rather than genuine connection, or that much of what people call love is actually dependency and projection, you become threatening to people who need to believe in romantic fairy tales to avoid confronting their own emotional patterns. Social and political narratives. When you start seeing through the simplified stories that political movements tell about complex problems, or recognizing that most social causes are as much about belonging and identity as they are about actual change, you become dangerous to people whose sense of meaning depends on believing they're fighting for absolute truth. Religious and spiritual certainties. When you start questioning religious dogma or spiritual platitudes, examining the psychological functions these beliefs serve rather than taking them at face value, you become heretical to people who need absolute certainty to manage their existential anxiety. Cultural and social norms. When you start seeing how arbitrary many social conventions are, how much of what people call normal is actually learned behavior that serves specific power structures, you become subversive to people who've never questioned why things are the way they are. Nietzsche observed that each of these areas represents what he called herd mentality, the human tendency to think, feel, and believe whatever the group thinks, feels, and believes, regardless of evidence or logic. He wrote, "Madness is rare in individuals. But in groups, parties, nations and ages, it is the rule. The herd doesn't just prefer conformity, it requires it. Independent thinking threatens the psychological comfort that comes from shared delusions, and the herd will instinctively move to eliminate or exclude the threat. This is why thinking people often find themselves increasingly isolated as they develop intellectual honesty. They're not choosing to be antisocial. They're being selected out by social groups that can't tolerate questioning. But here's what Nietzsche understood that most people miss. This rejection isn't random or personal. It's systematic and predictable. The thinking person threatens the non-thinking person's entire worldview simply by existing. Your willingness to question what others take for granted forces them to either examine their own beliefs or reject you to maintain their psychological comfort. Most people choose rejection. Nietzsche wrote, "A casual stroll through the lunatic asylum shows that faith does not prove anything." But try pointing this out in a group setting and watch what happens. People don't engage with your observation. They distance themselves from you. They don't debate your point. They question your motives, your mental health, or your social skills. This is what Nietzsche called the resentment of the mediocre, the instinctive hostility that average people feel toward anyone who refuses to remain average with them. Your thinking doesn't just make you different, it makes you dangerous. You represent the possibility that their comfortable assumptions might be wrong, that their life choices might be misguided, that their beliefs might be illusions. Rather than confront these possibilities, most people find it easier to decide that you're the problem. Nietzsche observed several specific ways that groups punish independent thinking. Intellectual ostracism. They stop inviting you to conversations, events, or social gatherings. Your presence becomes uncomfortable because you ask questions they don't want to answer and notice contradictions they prefer to ignore. Moral invalidation. They frame your thinking as a character flaw. You're not insightful. You're negative. You're not analytical. You're cynical. You're not honest. You're difficult. They transform intellectual honesty into social pathology. Social gaslighting. They make you question your own perceptions by insisting that obvious problems don't exist or that clear patterns aren't actually patterns. They use collective denial to make you feel crazy for seeing what you clearly see. Tribal excommunication. They gradually exclude you from the group by making your membership conditional on abandoning your questions and accepting their consensus reality. They force you to choose between thinking and belonging. Achievement minimization. They dismiss your insights, accomplishments, or observations by attributing them to luck, privilege, or ulterior motives. They can't acknowledge your intellectual capabilities without questioning their own limitations. Nietzsche understood that these aren't conscious, coordinated attacks. They're unconscious defensive reactions from people whose psychological security depends on not thinking too deeply about their own lives. But the effect is the same. The more honestly you think, the more isolated you become. This creates what Nietzsche called the philosopher's dilemma, the choice between intellectual integrity and social connection. You can think independently and be alone, or you can think collectively and belong. What you can't do is think independently and be accepted by people who've chosen not to think at all. Nietzsche wrote, "The surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently." Most social groups are organized around the principle of rewarding conformity and punishing difference. The more you develop your capacity for independent thought, the less you'll be rewarded by groups that prioritize agreement over accuracy. This doesn't mean you should stop thinking. Nietzsche believed that would be spiritual suicide. But it does mean you need to understand the social cost of intellectual honesty and decide whether you're willing to pay it. Nietzsche called people who chose thinking over belonging free spirits, individuals who valued truth more than comfort, authenticity more than acceptance, and intellectual integrity more than social approval. He wrote, "The free spirit will use things, but will not be used by them. He will honor institutions, but will not be enslaved by them." Free spirits understand that most social institutions, belief systems, and cultural norms exist primarily to provide psychological comfort and social cohesion, not to discover truth or promote individual development. They can participate in these systems when necessary, but they don't mistake participation for belief. They can play social roles without losing themselves in those roles. But Nietzsche also knew that becoming a free spirit requires accepting profound loneliness. When you see through the illusions that provide meaning for most people, you have to create your own meaning. When you can't participate genuinely in collective delusions, you have to find other sources of connection and purpose. This is why Nietzsche wrote, "What does not destroy me makes me stronger." The social rejection that comes with independent thinking either destroys your spirit or forces you to develop inner resources that most people never discover. You learn to find satisfaction in truth rather than approval. You develop the capacity for solitude rather than depending on constant social validation. You create meaning through personal values rather than accepting inherited purposes. But Nietzsche wasn't romanticizing isolation. He understood its real costs. When you think independently, you often have to navigate life without the psychological support systems that sustain most people. You can't rely on groupthink to make decisions for you. You can't use collective beliefs to avoid confronting difficult questions about existence, meaning, and mortality. You have to develop what Nietzsche called intellectual courage, the willingness to face reality without the comforting filters that most people use to make life bearable. This courage is rare because it's genuinely difficult. It's much easier to think what everyone else thinks, believe what everyone else believes, and want what everyone else wants. Independent thinking requires constant effort, perpetual questioning, and the emotional strength to stand alone when necessary. Nietzsche wrote, "He who would learn to fly one day must first learn to stand and walk and run and climb and dance. One cannot fly into flying." Intellectual independence is a skill that must be developed gradually. You can't suddenly decide to think for yourself after decades of thinking with the herd. The transition requires time, practice, and enormous psychological adjustment. But Nietzsche also believed that people who develop this capacity become capable of experiences and insights that remain forever closed to those who choose comfort over truth. The thinking person sees patterns that others miss, understands dynamics that others ignore, and recognizes possibilities that others can't imagine. They develop what Nietzsche called intellectual nobility, not the belief that they're better than others, but the recognition that they've chosen a more difficult and more honest path. This doesn't make them superior, it makes them different, and that difference inevitably creates distance from people who've made different choices. Nietzsche observed that thinking people often go through predictable stages in their relationship with society. Stage 1. Confusion. You notice that your thoughts are making you unpopular, but you don't understand why. You try to think less or share your insights more carefully, hoping to maintain social connections while preserving intellectual honesty. Stage 2. Frustration. You realize that the problem isn't how you express your thoughts, it's that you're thinking at all. You become frustrated with others' unwillingness to engage with ideas and their preference for comfortable assumptions over difficult truths. Stage 3. Acceptance. You understand that most people aren't capable of or interested in the kind of thinking that feels natural to you. You stop trying to convert others to intellectual curiosity and start accepting the social consequences of your mental processes. Stage 4. Integration. You learn to navigate social situations without compromising your intellectual integrity. You develop the ability to connect with people where they are while maintaining your own commitment to thinking deeply about life. Nietzsche believed that reaching stage 4 was essential for thinking people who wanted to avoid either bitterness or intellectual surrender. You can't force others to think more deeply, but you can choose how to respond to their preference for shallow waters. You can't make intellectual honesty popular, but you can decide whether to abandon it for the sake of popularity. The key insight Nietzsche offered is that the choice between thinking and belonging isn't a moral judgment, it's a psychological preference. Most people genuinely prefer the comfort of shared beliefs to the uncertainty of independent inquiry. They're not intellectually lazy, they're psychologically practical. Thinking independently is genuinely more difficult and often more painful than thinking collectively. But some people are built differently. They can't not think. They can't ignore contradictions, overlook patterns, or accept explanations that don't actually explain anything. For these people, Nietzsche offered both warning and encouragement. The warning: expect to be misunderstood, rejected, and often alone. Your intellectual honesty will threaten others' psychological security, and they will respond defensively. The encouragement: your willingness to think independently, despite its social costs, represents a form of courage that most people never develop. You're choosing truth over comfort, authenticity over acceptance, and intellectual integrity over social approval. Nietzsche wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe." Your struggle with social isolation isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that you're refusing to be overwhelmed by collective thinking. The more you think, the less they like you. But the more you think, the more you become yourself. And Nietzsche believed that becoming yourself, regardless of whether others like that self, is the highest achievement of human consciousness. The choice is yours. Think deeply and risk loneliness, or think shallowly and guarantee belonging. Most people choose belonging, but some choose thinking. If you're among those who choose thinking, welcome to the club of the intellectually honest. It's a smaller club, but Nietzsche would argue it's a more authentic one. The membership fee is high, often higher than you expect. But the alternative is abandoning the very capacity that makes you human. Your thoughts make you unpopular because they make you real. And in a world full of people playing roles and maintaining illusions, being real is both rare and threatening. But it's also the only way to discover what you're actually capable of when you stop limiting yourself to what others can understand or accept. If this exploration of thinking and social rejection resonates with you, subscribe for more insights into the psychology of intellectual independence and the courage required to think for yourself. Share in the comments. Have you noticed that deeper thinking has cost you relationships? How do you balance intellectual honesty with the need for human connection. Remember, the more you think, the less they like you. But the more you think, the more you discover who you really are beneath all the roles and expectations others have placed on you.